Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. I guess this is what you would traditionally call a kind of like podcast format, but we talk about something in specific each different time. This time I did want to touch on the Starfield weapons, because we do know that they are going to be using traditional kinetic weapons in Starfield. I don't think they're going to be using any energy weapons, or at least I've seen no evidence of that so far. We do also see that we do now have in Starfield hosted weapons. Now, to me, it is good to see this feature coming back into Bethesda games. In Fallout 4, the devs did actually get a fair amount of feedback and even criticism for their decision to not have hosterable weapons. And from an RPG aspect, that makes sense. You know, pulling weapons out of, nowhere really doesn't make too much sense. Now, ironically, at the same time, you can carry around, 8 different guns and 10,000 different pieces of junk in a backpack, which doesn't necessarily make all of the sense in the world. So people being that riled up over hosterable weapons, for me, was a non-issue. I'm not playing games for the realism in that degree, and for me it's more about the narrative, it's about the story, and it's also about having really good gameplay, and that's the main things for me that I'm looking for. And world design and characters looking good is important, but it's like something that's like a bar that you have to reach, whereas character development, having a good story, is something that can infinitely scale upwards in terms of quality in a way that I don't think visuals and having things like hosterable weapons really for me will ever have. I think it's also important to always keep in mind that the Starfield dev team has been working on this for a number of years, and whilst that is true, it's also important to keep in mind that they don't have even as big of a game dev studio size as Cyberpunk had. And I think GTA had something like 1,000 employees, which is like 3 times more than Starfield probably has working on it. We know Starfield has around 400 in total, and I don't know how many of those would, be marketing people and stuff like that. My point simply is, I think that we also do need to keep our expectations in check. Because obviously, if a game took 2 years to make, but it had 1,000 people working on it, that's probably going to be maybe even arguably the same amount of time as if, say, you had 400 people working on a project, but it took 4 years. So I still am hopeful that Starfield is going to be, in terms of scope, something very strong and impressive. But I'm not keeping my hopes too high, again, because they haven't got a crazy amount of employees, although they definitely are an AAA studio by any stretch of the imagination. From what I understand, from a mechanical standpoint, the reason that Fallout 4 did not have hosterable weapons was because the sizes of people's suits and the size of their characters changed so much that it wouldn't make any sense and it would feel and look a little bit weird. And so to get around that, they just didn't have hosterable weapons in Fallout 4. What this implies is that in Starfield, either that the character models are going to be similar in size and the suits are going to be similar in terms of fitting, or it means they found some technological solution which allows them to have weapons regardless of the person's stature or the outfit that they're wearing. We did also have another picture which had what seemed to be a grenade next to the gun. So we do definitely know that there are going to be some form of grenades in Starfield. I am interested to see how realistic this is, because obviously with real grenades I expect that they would have an impact on the hull of a ship if it was thrown in a ship. And that could have some very, let's just say, devastating consequences. I suspect that wouldn't be the case in Starfield, but it would be weird maybe if it was in the game, like you could just anytime just entirely kill a ship by throwing a grenade. That would be slightly too immersive probably, because it would ruin gameplay. And I'm just thinking now, like windows shattering when a grenade's thrown at them and stuff could, I think be too far in terms of immersion. So with this picture, with the weapon as well, there is an argument to be made that it's actually to do with the scope of the gun. Because on the gun, there is no scope itself, but there is like a scope rail that you could put a scope onto. So some people are arguing that it actually isn't a grenade and is just a scope for the gun. Now, of course, as well, from Starfield, we are going to have a plethora of different weapons to choose from. We could have melee weapons, and I'm hoping that they don't go too overboard with this, that it does stay within the confines of a sci-fi universe and doesn't go too fantasy. And the same goes for the ranged weapons that they choose to implement into the series. It does seem like a more, to me at least, a take on what civilization could be like in 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, and to kind of ruin that exploration by implementing in things which are very unlikely to, match up with how physics are. So, things like magical weapons, wands or whatever, to me would feel a little bit like a letdown. The same goes for like legendary weapons. I guess like if it's things that really shouldn't be in the game, but they want to put them in little crevices where you have to know about it to go find it, that's okay. So in Fallout 4, I think they had like an alien weapon that was pretty strong that you could pick up. But again, you aren't really going to ever find that unless you specifically went out of your way to find it. Maybe you find it by accident. But the point again here is if they do want to add that in, it has to be something that's out of the way. I am actually concerned though that people are going to take this too far. This logic that I just brung onto weapons, and they're going to apply it to space travel, they're going to apply it to the story, and I think that has certain limitations with it, because a part of having a good story is talking in fiction about metaphors and talking about stories that kind of are abstractly applicable to someone's life. And we see that throughout history, throughout books, throughout fiction, stories that again are metaphors for how people could, go through life and kind of exaggerated in order to tell a story. And I'm hoping that Starfield does still try to stay on that tradition, but just keeping it somewhat believable. So I'm not looking for a fantasy sci-fi when I'm saying this, I'm just looking for something that does stretch the bounds of imagination and possibilities in the same way that kind of like Star Trek would, or even I guess Star Wars with The Mandalorian and Boba Fett. Again, similarly trying to see how characters deal with situations based on, different factors and how people respond in different situations, and, kind of delving into different people's character of who they are as people. And I think that's interesting to kind of explore, and I'm again hoping that they don't rely so much on the sci-fi aspect of it in the same way that I was when I was talking about weapons, to a point where the story just becomes a very linear, predictable, kind of like boring thing. I don't think they'll go down that route. They've got aliens in the Starfield universe, so I'm not too worried about that. But I do also want to bring it up as something that I think could limit the game. Anyway, I'd love to hear what everyone here thinks. Feel free to leave your comments in the comment section. As always, have a great day. Subscribe if you haven't already. GG.